Welcome back to Stu Structures. We're here today to continue some of our information on doing research for your model railroad, so stay tuned. So welcome back to Stu Structures. I am Mark Stewart, your favorite ferroequestrianologist. And, I did a video not too long ago on research and the types of things that I had in my collection for doing research. And, a lot of people wonder, well, how does that really relate to model railroading? All the information that you collect out there, the pictures and blueprints and all that kind of stuff for buildings that you want to build are one thing. But it really depends on how in depth you want to go in moving your trains and doing the things with your layout that you may want to do. If you just want to throw a bunch of cars behind a locomotive and run them around and watch your trains, then all this doesn't necessarily pertain to you. If you're interested in more detail and little things that go on behind the scenes that you would see on your model railroad and things that the real railroads did that do correspond and are things that you notice as you're running around your layout, then a lot of this research does pertain to you. Some collar schemes. Paints, the B&O railroad that I model, changed its collar schemes over a period of time, so there are different things that come out that tell you during that period of time how you should paint buildings, how you should paint oil storage facilities next to railroad tracks. Just everything is covered. Signals, anything you can think of that was along the railroad had a standard for painting. So anyway, I recently came across this book, and it's basically a book of orders that the railroad has put out. Every time they put a new order out, this was the one for the Monongah Division on the B&O Railroad, Grafton, West Virginia in particular. And the guy's name, he had to sign off on each one of these new circulars as they came to him, so that the railroad said, well, yes, he knows what's going on. This is what should be happening in his division. Excuse me. So anyway, I got a book that is nothing but circulars from around 1954 from the Monongah Division for the guy that was in charge of the division at that time. So I'm just going to go through this book of circulars and show you some of what's in this book. There's a lot more out there than I'm going to go into, and some of it definitely does not pertain to modeling. But a lot of it can be used for modeling. Now, if you want to use one or two little things out of stuff like this, that's great. If you don't want to use any of it, that's great. Or if you really, really want to get down to particular cars and trains and what they had on them and the paint schemes and, just every little detail along the railroad, then all this stuff may pertain to you. So let's just jump into this, and I'll show you what's in this book and give you some ideas of what I'm talking about. Now, this book just covers so many different topics for this whole division and system-wide, actually. And the first page or so is just kind of an index of what's in the book and a place for the people to sign it, stating that, yes, I did read this and I do understand these are the rules. And, then it goes into handling system and private and foreign cars that are in bad order on the railroad. What was the situation for that? So if you model certain things, then maybe you want to go ahead and include some of this in a car that goes bad on your railroad and duplicate that happening on your model railroad. There's many things considering the transfer of cars at different junction points. Handling of investigations for accidents. Certain things have to happen on site when that happens. So if you have a model train that derails, what are you going to do to show that on your railroad? Certain things like prevention of electrical sparks near explosive stuff. Now, there might be certain items like fireboxes and stuff that are related close to items like that, so you would have to include little fireboxes with fire hoses and all that kind of thing near, explosives or things that are highly volatile. Rules for perishable freight. A lot of fruits and vegetables during this time period, or animals, livestock, and that type of thing that are handled over the railroad. There's a lot of things that could happen with those. Do you need to change the straw in the cars so often for livestock? Do you need to re-ice cars every once in a while? You know, there's just a lot of things that you could include in your model railroad if those are the things that you really, want to do. Now, if you're like me and you model the steam era, there's certain things that happen. Say there's a piece of scrap material that gets in the coal load of a steam locomotive. Well, the ones that have automatic loaders into the boilers, there's screws and stuff that turn all that material. What happens if you get a piece of scrap metal caught in it and it shuts down a steam locomotive? What are the procedures for swapping out the steam locomotive and getting another one in there and taking this one to be fixed if it can't be handled on a real close basis? There's certain rules for hours of service. How often do you have to have your crews swapped out? Are there places especially set aside for the diesels or the steam locomotives to stop so they can switch out crews? There's another thing here for special transportation rules for livestock. Livestock had to be watered every so often. We talked about changing the straw and the bedding and that type of thing earlier, but they had to be watered every so often, and they could only ride in cars so many hours before they had to be put into livestock pens and fed and stuff. So if they're going clear across the country, there's a lot of stops and things that have to happen with that. There's a page here on wire crossings. A lot of wires go overhead across railroads. What are the guidelines for doing that? Some are buried under the tracks. What are the rules for doing that? How would you simulate that on your model railroad? In a lot of areas where you have work going on even the main line, sometimes if you have accidents and that type of thing, but especially in yards, there are blue flags that can be set out that let people know not to go beyond that point down the track because there's stuff going on down there. What are the rules for setting out those blue flags or blue signs to mark that area? A lot of cars, especially cabooses, had certain equipment assigned to those cabooses. Some of it did show on the outside of the cabooses. A lot of time there were toolboxes under the edge of the cabooses, but even appliances on the outside of the cabooses were put there according to rules. Passenger car, a lot of inspections went into passenger cars, and a lot of it was done at interchange points and shops in between runs and that type of thing. And do you have the capability to do that on your model railroad if you want to? There's another page here for regs for smoking on premises. Even back in the day, that was something that was considered. Not that you have to I don't know if you want to have a smoking area on your model railroad, but if you want to be that prototypical, by all means. Then there is one here for paint colors for buildings exteriors, because everything did change over time, and there were certain rules and certain colors that had to be used to do painting on buildings. There's one page here for grade crossing IDs. There were certain fixtures during certain periods of times that were required at different types of crossings. A very minor farm crossing might not require a whole lot, but in town with a 2-lane highway or something requires a lot more, and there were ways that they identified them with numbers as to what that grade crossing was, so they could correspond that number to a location. There's certain rules for supply houses for paints and various cleaning stuff for locomotives and diesels. There's another page here for interior lists of passenger cars. I know I'm a passenger car enthusiast. I don't do a whole lot of interiors, but if you're doing interiors, certain cars had certain things in them that would have been required. There's another page here for painting storage boxes for near the railroad, whether it was for oil cans or spare fuses and stuff for caboose crews or whatever. Those boxes had to be certain colors. Handling
gas from damaged tank cars and stuff like that, volatile fuels. What were the rules if you want to model a damaged tank car on your model railroad? What were the rules, and how would you have to go about it, and what things would be required in doing that? There's rules for temporary structures, whether it be pits, putting some temporary rails in with spread out ties, just a lot of things like that can happen, and they're temporary structures. So what are the rules for doing that? A lot of equipment had speed recorders. There's a page in here that goes into the speed recorders, where they're located, how they are applied to and used on the specific railroad, whether it's for locomotives, diesels, gas electrics, or a lot of baggage cars and passenger trains had them so they could record speeds. The instructions for moving machinery on cars. There's a lot of rules applied to flat cars for machinery and that type of thing, so that they could be moved safely. So if you're doing flat cars with machinery, are you doing it prototypically if you want to? Inspection of freight cars. All freight cars had to be inspected every so often. Does your yard have tracks specially set up, and do you actually send some of your cars through your inspection area from time to time? There's special cards that need to be applied and kept on record for special container cars that move flour, grain, sugar, and that type of commodities by the rail, because there's a lot of rules to keep people safe and keep all this stuff from being contaminated. In here there's also a car card for shopping a car, so you could actually copy this from in here if you wanted to use it for your model railroad, and use the card as part of your model railroad actually, and use that particular system for doing it. There's rules and cards for open top loaded cars. They have to be certified every so often. Card clearance cards. A lot of cars are excess in size, whether it be width or height, and they have to be certified and cards issued for those cards if you want to. There's special rules for prep and handling of cars with no air brakes. Mostly this is within yards, and with the federal rules now, you just won't see this a whole lot out on main lines for sure. But within yards and stuff, there's special rules that have to be applied when you do that. Instruction, I do a lot of the steam locomotives like I've mentioned. Well, there's special instructions for preparing fires in boilers, especially if they're out on one of the lines somewhere where smoke and stuff could be a hazard to people. There's special instructions for the movement and maintenance of cranes and hoists. If you're modeling some of those things, even line side jib cranes and that type of thing for moving just wheels on and off tracks to work on cars. There's rules for those and special markings and various things that have to be done. There's special rules for moving deadheaded locomotives and tenders or diesels within trains. And there's a lot of employee signal rules and that type of thing as well that have to be followed. There's a page here for the special considerations for people doing sandblasting and painting. In today's world, I'm sure it's a lot more involved than what this one was back in the 50s. Now it probably requires, a tented area or a special building specifically for doing that kind of thing. There's a page here for special colors for painting signals, which may be different from some of the other painting rules. Page here for painting bridges, which most are black, but some use types of iron oxide paints and that type of thing. Special rules here for locomotive dispatchments and how that process was to happen. Rule rules here for commercial sidings, and you know, a lot of them came and went over the years, but there were rules they followed when they built them. You know, the quality of the rail sometimes was a little less high of a quality than mainline. There's just a lot of rules associated with that, which, you know, when you go to model, you know, it could make a big difference in the way your sidings look as compared to your main lines. Rules for time service and watches. You know, this doesn't necessarily apply. You can't hardly see a timepiece in HO other than maybe in a station, but I have seen people go to court over not having their watches inspected on time. There's pages here for how to use scales and weighing cars. You know, it had to be done in certain ways. So if you're, you know, if you have a scale in your yard and you're weighing cars, are these guidelines something that you could see when you're actually doing that in your yard? Installation, maintenance, and using of scales. Tracing for weigh bills, car load freight, and that type of thing. There's just so many things that you know, can apply but don't necessarily have to. Like I said, it depends on how prototypical you want to be. You know, you don't want to get so involved with all this stuff that it's so contaminating to your brain that it takes all the fun out of model railroading. I mean, there are times when I enjoy just watching trains run in circles. To me, sometimes that's wonderful. And then there are times when I really like to have a heavy duty op session where you're actually switching cars and industries and that type of thing. And there are times that I just enjoy going around and looking at the model railroad, the buildings, the people, vehicles, all that type of thing. And you know, it really tickles me when I can look at a photograph of a model railroad and I actually have to sit down and look at it for 10 minutes or so before I can spot something that tells me it's not real. You know, I don't have that kind of realism with my model railroads. I wish I was that good, but I'm not. But the more of these types of details that you do include visually in your model railroad, the more life you add to your railroad and the more realistic of an area it is for your trains to run through.
So there you have a good look at this book of circulars that was used on the B&O Railroad in the Monongah Division. Now, every division would have had a book similar to this, and the person in charge of that division would have had to sign off in his division like everybody else. The railroads like to hold people accountable for things, and when they're wrong, if this person was supposed to know what's going on and that's not what is going on, then that person was held responsible. The railroads had little court systems set up. I've read some trials for where people didn't have their watches inspected on time, and you know, several things that occurred on the railroad that people should have known better because they knew the rules and didn't follow them. So anyway, that's what this book of circulars is all about, and you can see there are a lot of things that can pertain to model railroading. Whether you want to use them on your model railroad or not is really entirely up to you. If you're really a serious rivet counter way beyond my levels, you might want to include all this stuff on your railroad. You know, I just touch on it real briefly. I don't include all of this stuff, but some things just make sense to try to use as you're building scenery and various things along your layout, and it adds interest to the layout as well and makes it more realistic. So in any case, thank you for coming back and sharing this time with me. I appreciate that. I hope you learned a little something from this. Like I said, not everybody follows these kind of guidelines when they build a model layout, but I just find it adds a lot of interest. So like and subscribe. You know, a lot of people don't know this information is out there. Share it with other people in the hobby. And hit the little bell beside the subscribe button and you'll be notified when the next episode that I put out comes out, whether it's build a building or doing some odd things like this on my channel as well. So in any case, it's winter time. Jump out there and start playing with your trains, scratch, build some buildings, and happy model railroading.